Welcome to IB Unplugged, a Cognity podcast for IBDP educators that tackles your submitted questions and challenges by connecting you with experts and peers who share their ideas and stories from real classrooms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of IB Unplugged. This week, we had the chance to talk with David Didau, and this was a long-term goal of mine, actually, to get to talk with him because he's a writer. He's authored a few very influential books. He's a speaker, a teacher, educational consultant. And for me, reading his books as an educator, as a practicing educator, there were a lot of things that he would bring up that helped me think very carefully about what I was doing and to think very intentionally about the practices I was using and how I was doing that within the classroom. And so what we decided to kind of lean into with this episode are just every educator's blind spots. What are the things that we're missing? What are the unknown assumptions we're making about our teaching and about the learning that's happening in our classroom? And how do we know if there's actual learning going on, and what sort of evidence should we be looking for? So David has some very interesting things to be commenting on, and in this episode we explore a lot of stuff. But basically the general thing that really pulls out from this is how can we be more skeptical as professional educators to know if what we're doing is actually effective, and therefore are we creating a really good IB diploma program experience for our students, helping them learn a lot along the way by truly genuinely understanding, do they know what we're talking about? Am I being effective? And can we progress to the next topic?
Yeah. No, I agree. I really liked the conversation, and there were a few things that I liked to pick up. So when we go through this episode, we're going to hear about some of the topics from his book about, like, what are some misconceptions. For example, he talks about extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation, and it's so important about working with the student's intrinsic motivation, but he kind of also talks about, like, you can't dismiss extrinsic motivation. It's part of society. It's part of the rest of your life as well. And some of the kind of pitfalls that might come from not acknowledging something that is still inherently present, especially in the IB, to be able to say, oh yeah, nobody cares about the scores of their IB exam. That's not realistic. And so right. I liked ideas like that of, like, this is here, it's not going away, but what do we do about it? And I think another thing that he talked about is your role as a teacher between being really a supportive person in this student's life and really showing a lot of kindness. And then he talks about the kind of spectrum or not spectrum between kindness and cruelty, of where sometimes it might feel like you can't be as kind for the student in that moment, but actually you're preparing them for being able to be more successful, and really juggling that balance between supporting and making sure that your students can thrive. And so, yeah, those are just a few of the topics that we talked about. I also loved the professional skepticism, because it's so easy to dismiss or be annoyed by a teacher who's always saying no, or says, like, I don't want to try that, it's never going to work. But actually, when you have healthy skepticism, that's really where you guys can grow in a school. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, a great episode. Looking forward to hearing what you all think, and let's bring on David.
Hi, David. Welcome to IB Unplugged. We're glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're really excited for this conversation. We're going to be looking into some really great educational practices, what we've kind of called every educator's blind spots, recognizing that there are some things that we could all be doing a little bit better or differently. But before we get into all of that, we always like to start our podcast with asking our guests a few warm-up questions. The first one being, why education?
Well, it wasn't planned, to be absolutely honest. It's something that I fell into. The holidays looked good. And yeah, I finished university. I'd had some really boring office jobs, and a friend's girlfriend, we were around there having dinner, and she said, oh, why don't you come into my school and, have a look at, just come and visit and spend the day. And I did that, and I was inspired to apply to do teacher training, and the rest, as they say, is history. Although I do want to sort of say that I was absolutely rubbish when I started. I was really, really bad. I sometimes joke that I took to teaching like a fridge to water. I was not a natural. Yeah, I'm a testament to hard work and perseverance.
What makes you think that you weren't the world's best teacher on day one?
Well, students, bless them, give you unambiguous feedback, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. There's no filter often.
No.
Yeah. And so, you started teaching, you've kind of progressed through, you've been able to author and do a lot of other stuff in the space in education, and kind of taking all of those experiences, but looking forward, how would you see the role of educators evolving in the next decade?
My hunch is that I don't expect that much in the way of evolution. I think, the concept of school has remained, it's been remarkably consistent for the last 4,000 years. We've got archaeological sort of evidence of schools from ancient Sumer. And so where there have been cultural innovations which have outstripped our ability to pick things up sort of from the environment, schools emerge. They're an emergent technology. Steven Pinker talks about schools as being technology for communicating things that we're innately bad at learning. And I think if our experience of the COVID pandemic teaches us anything, it's that doing education other than in schools comes with some pretty severe trade-offs. So I think the role of the teacher, the role of the school is, I think it will take a lot to dislodge it. That's my hunch.
Okay.
I've been wrong before.
But that's good to hear. Often, people are kind of immediately saying, oh, it's going to transform quickly because of AI and all this sort of stuff. But it sounds like what you're saying is the fundamental aspect of being an educator in a school is going to remain intact.
I think the human to human connection that's required to sort of nurture children through a cognitive apprenticeship is something that I think that we can have a minority of children who are quite happy to do that online in some form. But I think for the vast majority of us, we need other humans.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And schools are very convenient ways of gathering and scaling that process in a way which makes it affordable for society as much as anything else, practical for large groups of people. I'm always fascinated by the idea that where states don't mandate schools, where states don't supply schools, schools emerge. So if you look at, rural India and parts of Africa, the emergence of low-cost, publicly provided schools from the community where a bunch of adults who know some stuff and a bunch of kids that don't know that stuff come together in a space in order for schooling to happen. Mm-hmm. It's really quite remarkable.
It's really quite fascinating to kind of create this, miniature culture dynamic of kind of what we want to create as a society and how that builds itself out to help create positive contributors to society as well. Yeah, good point. Now, obviously, David, you've got a pretty impressive career. You've done quite a bit of work, obviously, as an education consultant, teacher, speaker, writer. I've got a couple of your books that have influenced my teaching over some time as well. We've got What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology has been on my shelf for a little while, and What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong, another one that I've just recently been able to dig into a bit. They really highlight some important aspects about teaching and learning specifically. And I think in the IB diploma program, sometimes we focus so much on performance. We focus so much on getting to the actual grades that sometimes we forget about some of the key things that are going to be really important for educational process itself. I wonder if you could start us off by talking a little bit about what motivated you to write these books in the first place. And in particular, these two with regard to education and what we might be missing and how we could do it better.
Right. Okay. So I started writing before I wrote any books. I was writing a blog. I think I started my blog in 2010, and initially it was to kind of remember things. So I had this sense that I'd be constantly reinventing the wheel. I'd have great ideas and then I'd forget what they were because life's busy, right? Yeah. And so I started just recording the things that I was doing in my classroom in order to have a record, if nothing else. And as I started writing and as I started sort of communicating and engaging with other people in that space, it just became clear that a lot of the assumptions that I'd had for years were very much that. They were assumptions based on not that much. And so I think that a big motivator for me in writing was to try and work through my own confusions and my own journey into learning more about the profession of teaching. And so those two books in particular, so What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong? I think that came out in about 2015 or something. So it feels like a long time ago for me. And when I wrote it, I mean, it's a bit of a big beast. There's a lot of it, and I thought I might never ever get the opportunity to write a book ever again. So I'm going to put everything in it.
That explains the thickness of this thing.
Yeah, right. And you've got when it was published in hardback, and it was twice the width of that copy that you've got there originally. Yeah. And so I guess what had prompted that is that I'd had this sense of, I was a pretty good teacher. I knew, I could certainly put on really slick lessons, and I'd written about a sequence of lessons that I'd completed, and another teacher on Twitter got in touch, Christina Milosh, who at the time was based in Rome, got in touch to say, have you ever seen this? And she sent me a video of Robert Björk talking about the difference between learning and performance. And my world crumbled. It changed everything. I can't really overemphasize what a psychic shock it was to have the rug pulled from under me.
What was so shocking about it?
Right. So what Björk's whole approach and position is that learning is something which is invisible. It takes place inside our minds. We can't observe it directly. All we can do is see performance. And performance can be, it can be answering a question. It can be writing an essay, solving an equation, taking part in a sports match, whatever. Anything that's perceptible with your senses is performance. And that we can only infer learning by looking at performance. And he was also making the case that performance can be a very poor proxy for learning, especially performance immediately after instruction. So, as a caricature, I'd be saying to my classes, essentially, can you do what I just showed you how to do?
Right.
Oh, you can. Great learning.
Yeah. Look at me, an excellent teacher, and you, a wonderful learner.
And even, and I think back, and even, I'd say, can you do what I just showed you how to do? And they couldn't. And I'd say things like, look back in your book, talk to your partner.
Right.
It's on the board.
Yeah.
And then they'd give me the performance that it was clear I was queuing them up to give, and I'd mistake that for learning. And, that is a caricature, but I started seeing it in everything I was doing and everything everybody else was doing. Mm-hmm. And I thought I really want to explore this. And so when I started writing that book, I wrote to Robert Björk at UCLA, and like almost every academic I've ever connected with, they are so grateful that people read their academic papers.
You just feel like, I just have to publish.
Right. They kind of believe they're in this sort of bubble and no one cares beyond academia. And so when I got in touch, he was like, yeah, no, that would be terrific. I love the fact that, my work is making an influence in actual classrooms. And then he very, very generously, I was so nervous submitting not so much to the publisher, but to Bob Björk, the final text, and thinking, what if he thinks it's rubbish? Yeah. And very, very kindly, he agreed to write a foreword, endorsing it, and that was a very proud moment for me. Anyway, that's what if, and then the other of the books you mentioned, what every teacher needs to know about psychology. So I wrote that with a friend of mine, Nick Rose, whose background is in psychology. In fact, he used to be a parapsychologist, of all things, like a Ghostbuster.
That's what I thought, but I was like, I can't be right.
Yeah. So he worked at Bristol University, and people, on the parapsychology departments, and people would phone up.
They have a whole department.
Well, it was 2 people.
Okay.
Please tell me they go by Ghostbusters.
Yeah. People would phone up and say, our house is haunted. And he'd say, yeah, it's just the wind.
Yeah.
And that was his job, basically debunking the fact that there is paranormal stuff going on. But they'd run proper experiments, and they'd run like actual legitimate tests. And, he talked about the fact that despite the robust nature of their investigations, no one ever believed them. But it must be a ghost. Okay, right.
So come back full circle. Even though they could perform and they could show the actual evidence on what was performed, you went back and went, no, you haven't learned this right. There wasn't something there.
Exactly. So anyway, that was his background. And then he retrained as a teacher, and he was teaching psychology. And we were talking about the fact that it would be really, really useful to have, there are lots and lots of books on psychology out there, but we thought it'd be really useful to have a kind of like, this is the useful stuff for teachers. And we both read a book called 59 Seconds by Richard Wiseman, which I'd really recommend. And it's about the self-help industry and all of the information that's flooded into that. And what he did was he took each of the claims and the areas of that, distilled the actual research, and then made a series of recommendations, things you could do, in 59 seconds. That was the conceit of the book. And we thought that would be a fantastic structure for this psychology book that we were imagining. And that's exactly what we did. So in each of the areas of psychology that we chose to write about, we distilled the research, we thought about it from a classroom perspective, and then we distilled it to a series of bullet points of bits of advice that would be useful for a busy teacher. And it was really, really interesting. I remember being interviewed with Nick after we'd published the book, and the interviewer, who, bless them, hadn't read it, but they were like, oh, it's about time that somebody wrote a book about psychology in education because, kids need more sort of understanding and caring, and they need more sort of therapeutic stuff.
Yeah, they were thinking more from like clinical psychology.
Yeah, we're like, no, not that psychology. We don't care about that stuff.
Yeah. But actually understanding how the mind works and how we can influence that as educators as well.
How motivation works, how resilience works.
Yeah.
And all of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And that was, at least for me, when I was reading over it, the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation part was really one that stuck out to me. And I think especially when we kind of tune it back to IB and the diploma program itself, we've got students who they put a lot of emphasis on that extrinsic piece. What's my grade going to be, and how's that going to influence my future? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like that element, that sort of how we as teachers can balance developing that intrinsic motivation in students with what's very obviously the extrinsic motivation that they're like, well, I have to get this grade so I can get onto that university so I can go to the next thing. How can we kind of navigate that a bit better, you think? So
I think there's a default that extrinsic motivation is bad and intrinsic is good. And I think that's unhelpful.
Okay.
That we're all extrinsically motivated, and that's completely legitimate, that we do what we do, if nothing else, to sort of pay the rent. And that's a reasonable motivator. The self-determination theory is a bit more complex and nuanced than that. And I can't remember all the different categories, but there are at least 3 elements of extrinsic motivation, 2 of which come from inside. And so sort of thinking about the fact that, the idea of being intrinsically motivated, having a love and a passion for what you're doing is great, is wonderful, but it's not going to be, you were saying, John, you're a chemistry teacher. With the best will in the world, not every student you teach is going to have a passion for chemistry, but they still have very good reasons for wanting to learn the chemistry that you're teaching, and they want to do something with it. It's a means to an end, and that's a really legitimate thing that needs to be validated, I think. So passion, wonderful, but relatively speaking, rare. And I think it's worth also thinking about motivation from an evolutionary perspective. So I'm really interested in David Geary's take on motivation. He says that we have a motivational bias to learning things which have an evolutionary basis. Things like getting on with other people, looking at how plants and animals work and how to use inanimate objects. And these are sometimes referred to as folk disciplines, folk psychology, folk physics, and folk biology. Especially as the motivational bias increases and sort of is at its most intense during adolescence. And you just look at adolescents in schools and they want to do things like chat, flirt, twang rulers to see what will happen, all of that. Look at pictures of cats on the internet. All of that stuff makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, whereas other culturally specific bodies of knowledge, like chemistry, are things which are really useful and arguably very important, but and we have a capacity, the natural plasticity of our brains means that we can learn those things. It's just harder for us. We have to put more effort in, and it's not as much fun for most of us unless we, happen to have that wonderful passion for the subject. I don't know if that helps.
No, absolutely. So when I've been able to teach a bit of biology as well, when I teach biology, I'm doing a lot on like the evolutionary aspects that lead to fitness and how an individual is more fit in their particular group. So what you're talking about here definitely plays into the idea of that social fitness, and where a school might be a mini society, and therefore as they go on to greater society, they're going to look at those things that are going to help them fit into society more and therefore be more attuned to learning them better. So from that angle, I guess, as you're talking about from an evolutionary psychology point, it really makes sense that things like a grade or something that's going to lead to, as you say, paying the rent is going to be important in the mind's eye of anybody, because that's what's going to allow them to fit within their society.
It's also what they know the parent cares about too.
Yeah.
And it's like there's that conversation and feedback loop with the parents as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there would be a problem if we were turning out students who are like, I'm only prepared to do what I'm passionate about. That it's useful for society as well as on an individual basis to kind of knuckle down and do stuff that we don't necessarily want to do, and to have extrinsic motivators to those ends, I think is important. And I think there's also, you can tap into the ideas from research into peer culture here, that there are within a school, you can have a peer culture which is supportive of those kinds of extrinsic motivators, and you can also experience schools where that isn't the case. And so where there is a peer culture which values learning, where it's cool to be clever, that's much easier for children to tap into useful extrinsic motivators than schools where that isn't the case.
Are you an IB educator wanting to improve your practice and needing just a bit more support getting there? Have you ever wanted to learn more about a specific aspect of the DP program, or ask a question to an educational theorist about a specific IB aspect? IB Unplugged is the place for you. Simply visit cognity.com/IB Unplugged to submit your question to us and have your question explored in more detail in an upcoming episode. And now, back to the show.
So what I'm hearing here is that we don't have to constantly shy away from extrinsic motivation as if it's a bad thing. It's good to recognize that this is actually a human experience. It's a human trait. And that as teachers in the IB diploma program, for example, it is something that's going to motivate students anyway. So we don't necessarily have to shy all the way away from it. And also recognize that in our many cultures that we're creating here, if we have a group that values that sort of, as you say, it's cool to be good at school, therefore we're going to see a little bit better performances. We're going to see better appreciation of educational experiences, because it helps them fit more into their group. Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. I think we should celebrate both sides. That it's lovely when children are passionate about something, and we absolutely want to celebrate that. But we also want to develop a mindset where we are prepared to work and persist with things that we don't find obviously pleasurable.
I also really like the idea about building the culture. Something that I was thinking about, there's like the analogy of with the crabs in the bucket. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, where the idea is like if a crab is trying to get out of the bucket, the rest of them pull them down because they don't want that crab to escape. We've talked about it in my household. My husband's French, of like with French people, like French students mocking students that are trying to lose the French accent when they're speaking English, for example. And I think that it's about kind of knowing when you're a teacher, like recognizing what's going on in like the social dynamics of the class also, and not being against them, but also kind of recognizing when you do need to step in and kind of influence certain motivators as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of a later book that I wrote after those two was one called Making Kids Cleverer. And I wrote extensively about what you can do as an adult, a non-member of a peer culture, to influence peer culture. For listeners, viewers, I'd really recommend, it's quite old now, but I'd really recommend Judith Rich Harris's book, The Nurture Assumption, which really explores just how powerful peer influences are and the sorts of things that we can do to get more of what we want.
You comment on this kind of often. This is like a running theme, I think, in some of the writings, at least that I've been able to encounter, of just this idea of especially educators questioning assumptions that we might make. What we think are accepted educational norms, we just sort of let into one with like extrinsic motivation's a bad thing, and let's focus on passions and that sort of thing. What are some of the other like bigger assumptions you feel like we might make as teachers that are limiting our interactions with students and their ability to learn?
Yeah, so that one I mentioned earlier, that mistaking performance for learning, I think is a pretty fundamental assumption that is very difficult to escape from. And it's difficult because learning doesn't happen in the present tense, but we exist in the present. So I characterize learning as being a quality of elsewhere and later. The definition I use of learning is the retention and transfer of knowledge. And so, if I teach you something and you can't remember it tomorrow, it's not very helpful to refer to that as learning. Or if I teach you something and you can perform it in the classroom, but you can't perform it elsewhere, is that helpful to describe that as something that you've learned? So if I want to be certain that you've learned something, I have to follow you about and check at different times and in different places, which we don't really get to. That would be quite annoying for students if we were doing that kind of thing. And so we don't do that for obvious reasons. I think we might run afoul of safeguarding.
Most likely, definitely.
Yeah, I know. So,
but then what could you do besides follow children around and ask them random questions?
So what could you do is you have to engineer in the thin slice of the present in which we occupy opportunities for trying to peer into elsewhere and later. There's some really, so if we take retention first, that first bit, so that's relatively simple. So Bjork coined the idea of a desirable difficulty. And a desirable difficulty is something which induces struggle in performance, but crucially results in success. So something where you have to dredge into your mind to try and find the performance, but you're not going to fail. You're going to be supported. And so if it's too much struggle, you're going to get some help. And to that end, that what I used to do was to say, right, everybody, let's work towards a really slick performance. I'll give you all the help and support you need so that you can be perfect. And there's a time and a place for that, but it's really, really poor evidence of learning. It's great for building up a sense of success. It's great for motivation, but it's a very poor proxy for learning. So what I'd want to do as rapidly as I could would be to say, I'm going to take away some of the structures that I've given you, and I'm going to ask you to try and remember what they were and try and recreate them for yourself. And that struggle of having to sit with that and try and do it increasingly independently is a desirable difficulty. And there's lots of really good evidence on some of the techniques that I'm sure listeners, viewers will be familiar with, things like the spacing effect, that just returning to things after a certain amount of time has passed slows the rate at which we forget in the future. Things like the testing effect, so trying to recall rather than relearn information is better for future performance. Those kinds of things are things that we can intentionally put in place in our classrooms. But when it comes to transfer, the evidence on transferring knowledge from one domain to another, from one place to another, one context to another, is much, much less robust and secure than the evidence on retention. One of the studies which I read, and it really startled me, and I've recreated several times in classrooms, is the finding that a student will be able to perform something in a certain seat, and you move them out of that seat and seat them elsewhere in the classroom.
Yeah.
Right.
And they'll struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because we rely on the cues that visual and emotional, of the context in which we learn something. So you're sitting next to someone you like, and there's various stuff in your eye line, and I put you somewhere where you don't have those emotional and visual reminders, it's harder.
Yeah.
And if it's hard to change seats in a classroom, it's certainly harder to move from the classroom to an examination hall, and then moving from the exam hall into life. Is a challenge. And so trying to intentionally create those situations where you're not just as easily as possible being able to lean into those cues and prompts that you've absorbed whilst you've been learning, to disrupt those in ways which are helpful, is something that I think that teachers can experiment with.
Absolutely. It reminds me a lot of Eric Jensen put out a couple of books, Teaching with the Brain in Mind. And I remember reading those ones as well. And it really shifted the way that I approached my actual lessons in terms of not just the content, but the actual environment. How am I shifting the environment?
Yeah.
Where are students seated? What, as you say, what's at their eye line? What are they hearing? What are the other senses that are going on in the room that are going to help them with that, with the overall learning? And then now as a DP coordinator at my school, whenever we do mock exams, the sort of let's prepare, here's what it's going to look like, I constantly emphasize with the team, just we have to make this as real of an experience as possible. All the same restrictions, all the same protocol, make it as real as the real thing so that students are used to that and that it's not a complete, wake up.
I mean, in the ideal world, all instruction would take place in the exam hall. That's not practical.
Certainly, yeah. But I also love what you mentioned there at the end with they have to learn how to they're kind of surprised by being in this exam hall, for lack of a better term, and then they go into real life. And now here's another way that they have to express that. And I can't remember exactly the wording of it or who I need to attribute this to, so my apologies. But it was effectively this idea of you learn how to do high school, and then you have to go to university and you learn how to do university. And then you have to kind of relearn how to do life and work and that sort of thing again. And so this concept of the skills and the specific content we learn is more a vehicle of describing or how to develop a young learner so that they can learn quicker when they're put into these new environments of wherever they might be, and that the performative aspect sort of shifts from the exam hall to whatever that might be in our real lives. Is that something that you've come across as well? Or do you feel like that's kind of an accurate depiction of what happens with young people as they move on from school?
That it's hard, that it's a struggle.
Sure, yeah. No, just that idea that that we're constantly having to adjust to new ways of performing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a school does its best to be a microcosm of the wider world, and and we try to intentionally recreate or create environments which are going to be useful and transferable later on. But one of the other thing that we do in school is that we are probably the most understanding and the kindest and the most forgiving environment that children will ever experience. That when they become adults, the adult world is a lot less supportive and forgiving and intolerant. And I don't think it's a reasonable thing to say, actually, we want to build in some intolerance so that kids are kind of more prepared for it. I don't think that would fly well with most educators. Mm-hmm. So that's a trade-off. Mm-hmm. You know, there's an interesting dynamic there. That the old adage that it's kindness and cruelty are not as polarized as we might think, and that sometimes not being explicitly kind is actually the kinder thing to do in the longer term is something I think we struggle with in education. We're talking about assumptions. I think one of the assumptions that I think is really prevalent is that, one, direct instruction is dull, and two, that children don't like it. And both of those are in flat contradiction to my experience. If you're doing direct instruction and it's boring and the children aren't enjoying it, you're not doing direct instruction. You're doing something else. You're probably lecturing. If you've ever seen that Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where Ben Steen is the teacher and he's there talking about economics, and he's saying every now and again, "Can anyone answer this question? Anyone?
And
yeah, and the kids are all drooling on the desk and sort of paying no attention. That's not direct instruction. That is antithetical to what I think teachers should be doing in the classrooms. So the approach that I recommend, what I do, is incredibly fast-paced, it's incredibly interactive. Kids are on their toes, they're involved, they're participating all the way through. And for me, I think there are three questions that teachers have to be able to ask and answer of every lesson. And the first is, how do I know if they're all paying attention? Mm-hmm. You know, what am I doing? What are the moves I'm making to check that everyone's tuned in? And secondly, how do I know they're all making sense of what's going on? You know, that's a step up. What's their understanding? And what am I going to do if their understanding is not what I hoped it would be? And then the third question is, how do I know that everybody's getting better at the stuff I want them to get better at? And if I have those three questions driving what I'm doing, it results in that really interactive, fast-paced, involving, high participation classroom. But secondly, it results in me knowing things that I otherwise wouldn't know. So if what I used to do is I'd teach and I'd sort of have an assumption, like I think they got it. I think they understood. But because I didn't know, that would often be based on a false premise. When I teach now, I know whether, who was paying attention, who wasn't, who made sense, who didn't, who's got better, who hasn't yet. And so that I can respond to that, I can do something about it.
Mm-hmm. What I really like about those three questions is they fit kind of anywhere, and they really focus a lot on the learning. And so kind of coming back to more the top of the show when we were saying, that we could have people sort of developing at a different pace. They didn't have to immediately tell us what they knew. If you were a teacher who's with that student all the time, then you can get a better idea of like, have they learned this? How can they demonstrate their learning over a long period of time? And what I really like about those three questions is, again, it constantly comes back to how am I emphasizing the learning that's happening within students? And that can be through a direct instruction model, possibly an inquiry-based learning, or some other thing that might take place within the lesson. But if those three questions are driving what I'm doing, that can make a bigger difference, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the reason I have come to use them is seeing so many schools investing professional development time into training teachers in using techniques, and then teachers trying to use those techniques, often unsuccessfully, because they don't really know why they're using them. They're not sure what they're deployed in service for. So I always use mini whiteboards in my lessons. I think they're a really incredibly useful bit of kit for exposing thinking and seeing stuff that I'd otherwise miss, and increasing the participation ratio in a classroom. But I would use them differently to answer each of those 3 questions. So if I want to check attention, then I'd have little show me routines, and I'd be getting everybody to sort of very quickly demonstrate what their response is to a particular prompt. If I'm checking understanding, I'll have them using them as sandpits, as places to test out ideas before taking them any further. And if I'm using them to consolidate skill development, then I'll be using them to as a first step in extending ideas in a more formal way. It's the same technique on the surface, but because they're deployed in different services, and it needs a different set of moves that I'm going to make in order for me to be able to answer the question I've posed to myself.
Today's Cog Tip comes from Miles Bebbington from Wellington College International, Shanghai. He says, I use cognitive strength test questions as a starter of every lesson to support my students in recalling content from the previous lesson. It's a really nice way of re-emphasizing points taught in the previous lesson. I also try to regularly demonstrate to students where to find strength questions in the platform so they know how to self-revise. And don't forget the battle feature that lets students make it into a competition. Thanks, Miles.
Let me try to summarize here. I think what I've heard is that we can commonly make assumptions about certain techniques being bad, like direct instruction is a bad thing, but not all direct instruction is the same. And therefore, the way that I approach my direct instruction makes a bigger difference as opposed to just generalizing and saying direct instruction is a bad thing.
I'd go further than that, John. I'd say that unless direct instruction is fast-paced, interactive, high participation, and essentially joyful, it isn't direct instruction.
Oh, okay.
So if you're droning on and boring kids, I don't know what you're doing, but it isn't direct instruction.
Nice. Okay.
So a useful kind of explanatory tool, I think, is to say that if you're not assessing, you're not teaching.
Okay.
So if I'm standing in front of doing a professional development lecture for teachers, I'm always really, really mindful to say what I'm doing now is not teaching. I'm talking to you. I've got no real way of assessing whether you're paying attention, whether you're making sense of what I'm saying, and whether you're getting better at anything. That if I was teaching, I'd be able to answer those questions. Mm-hmm. In order to be able to answer those questions, you would have to be doing a hell of a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that looks really different. So one of the things that I always offer when I work with schools is that whether it's at a conference or whether it's in a school itself, I always say, if you can round up some kids and allow me to demonstrate what direct instruction ought to look like, then the penny drops, and nobody's in any doubt that there's a real difference between direct instruction and rubbish instruction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But you bring up a great point there with regard to how I'm assessing in order to tell me what's really being learned and what's sort of teaching. And when we think about traditional methods of assessment, what are we missing, and what are some of the opportunities there that could really inform us a lot more if students have learned something, if we're effectively having that sort of knowledge and skill transfer going on?
So can I check there, John? So when you say assessing, are you talking about that sort of classroom process of where are children right now, or are you talking about more formal events where we get them to put pen to paper?
I mean, I guess to a certain extent, both the assessment of learning and the assessment for learning, that okay, are we all here on the same page? Let's kind of move, like what you were talking about, that high paced, let me make sure you've got your attention. Let me make sure you're with me.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a sort of flow chart in my mind in the classroom where, whenever I ask a question, then my next question to myself is, did everybody get the question right? And obviously that tells you something about how I'm expecting response, which is why I use mini whiteboards. So I'll ask a question, everybody writes an answer, everybody holds it up. I'm able to see, did everybody get it right? And if the answer to that is no, then, I need to think, did anybody get it right? If nobody got it right, that's clearly on me. If I pose a question, I give a task, nobody can do it, clearly something's gone wrong, my curriculum's wonky, the way I taught it was ineffective, I need to own that and do something about it. But my next question is, if somebody got it right, how many, what's the proportion that got it right? And I'm really guided here by Barak Rosenshine in his Principles of Instruction. He talks about 100% of students experiencing a success ratio of above 80%. So I'm looking there at is everybody getting at least 80% of stuff right? And again, if not, if the answer to that is no, I'm going to have to own that. There's no percentage in blaming the kids. That's my responsibility. I need to find the gaps that they're falling into and fill those gaps appropriately. And then when everybody can answer the question, when everyone can do the thing, my next question to myself is this the first time? Is this a one-off? Or is this something that they've done on repeated occasions? If it's a one-off, great, that's nice, but it's a very poor proxy for learning. I'm certainly not going to make any assumptions that they're able to retain or transfer it. So I'm going to repeat and go over it, maybe during the lesson, maybe park it for later lessons. But once I've got that 100% of students getting a ratio of about 80% correct on multiple occasions, then I can feel cautiously optimistic about moving on and considering that being something that's mastered. And that word mastered, I think, does a lot of sneaky work in the field of education. It's sort of different people use it and it means completely different things. But for me, it is around that idea of 100% of students getting 80% of responses correct. So the way in which I think about formal assessment events is, well, traditionally, if you think about IB, like the IB exam, that in psychometric terms, that would be, you can describe that as a discriminatory assessment. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is its purpose is to discriminate between the students who take it. So you create a rank order and you've got the worst and the best and everybody else somewhere in between. And that's how they're going to be judged. That's how they're going to get their final award. And we definitely need to be mindful that that's in the background and something that we're moving towards. But replicating that structure, just having discriminatory assessment events, is not very helpful, because the discriminatory assessments are designed that not everybody can do everything on the paper.
Right.
And so you'll have some children who are being successful on the paper despite the fact they've not been explicitly taught how to do the thing. And you'll have other children who are being unsuccessful because they haven't been taught. And again, I think that because despite lens is a really, really useful way to interrogate practice. So what I recommend, what I've put a lot of work into over the last few years is trying to design mastery assessments. So a mastery assessment is one where, instead of getting a normal distribution at the end of it, your distribution is much more like a slope, mm-hmm. where, again, you're looking for 100% of students to get at least 80% of the content correct. And so you're going to need to have a much, much tighter relationship between the construct you're assessing and the item that you're using to assess that construct. So there's much less ambiguity about what exactly they're achieving and why they've achieved it. And the usefulness of mastery assessment is it's the only way that you can find out anything at all about your effectiveness as a teacher, as a school. So, if we go back to the discriminatory assessments, people are successful for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Mm-hmm. And we claim credit, of course.
Yeah.
In extreme cases, it's because they've gone and got tutors to compensate for our poor instruction.
Sure.
But even without that some children are just lucky and others less fortunate. So if we have a mastery assessment, we're only assessing things that we've explicitly taught, and that we're trying to remove subjectivity. And so I recommend using, instead of having rubrics which look at how well somebody did something, it would be much more a binary: met, not met, done, achieved, not achieved. And so by that, I can build up a much, much more useful picture of exactly what my students can and can't do. And then I can look at that and go, okay, I've got some gaps here. If one kid can't do a thing that I assessed, then, that's maybe they were absence, maybe they just really struggled with that. Maybe, that's something I need to pay attention to. But if 4 or 5 kids couldn't do something, that's really useful feedback to me that I haven't taught that as well as I needed to. And that's, you can't get that information unless you try and use less discriminatory and more mastery assessment.
What I like about kind of everything you've mentioned here is it's very much a digging for evidence and really understanding what that evidence is in terms of telling you how you've taught and how well students have learned, but also are the students understanding this before they can move on to the next thing? So it informs the progress, but what's really clear is whatever assessment models we're using, we need to be firstly aware, are we doing mainly discriminatory assessment, or are we doing something that's going to help understanding for mastery? And then do we use that as evidence to inform our teaching, and do we use that as evidence to help the students progress as well?
Yeah, absolutely that.
And what I like from what you've just said, and then also, I guess what I've read as well in terms of your books that you put out, is just that it's constantly taking on this position of almost being like a skeptic of how do I know that this really actually is working, right? How do I know that what I'm doing is effective? How do I know that the students have learned? And even back to what we were talking about earlier with assumptions and that sort of thing. How do I know that that's a true thing? To what extent do you feel like as educators, or rather just how much should we be taking on that position more frequently, I guess? And it's a very leading question, I know, but...
No. It is a leading question. And you already know something of the answer that I'm likely to give. So my friend Nick Rose, that I wrote What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology with, coined this phrase, which I love, of professional skepticism. And the way I would view it is that if you are a teacher, you have a duty to be professionally skeptical. And the professional bits is important, because you don't want people just going, yeah, that won't work. That they're just annoying.
And we all know them. They're all in our classes, in our schools.
Yeah. And I do think we should listen more to those people and help them be more professional in their skepticism, because they do have often valuable insights. They tend to be people who've taught for a long time and have knowledge that we would be enriched by accessing, but the way they contribute is often not helpful.
Yeah, you can only see the negative in it instead of the supportive
So
part.
A professional skeptic is somebody who's got who isn't credulous, who isn't likely to be taken in by gimmickry, because they're going to be asking questions like, okay, so what's the evidence base for this? Like, what are the plausible mechanisms why this thing might work? And to really interrogate and look at that, the underlying assumptions for the things that we're asked to do. And I think that the best schools, the schools which I most enjoy working with and that I've got the most respect for, are ones which encourage professional skepticism from their teachers. So the worst schools are the ones which just expect compliance. This is what we're doing, just get on with it. Those are terrible places to work and to learn in. Really, really poor modelling for students about what it is to be in the world. But schools where there is an expectation that we say, we think this is a good bet. We think that as an organisation we should lean into this. But of course we don't know. So we invite you, this is the evidence base we've looked at. We invite you to look at it and see if there's anything we missed. These are what we think are the plausible reasons why it would work here. We invite you to critique that. And that we're going to hold ourselves to account for our implementation of this thing that we're betting on. And we're gonna do things like we're gonna pilot it in the smaller groups rather than just going all in. We're going to, have clear time limits where we say, at this point, these are the questions that we're gonna ask to know whether what's actually happened is matching up with what we thought would happen. And that we will ask you as a body of staff to engage in a process of discussion. We'll do things where we'll run pre-mortems, where before we launch, we'll say, what are the things which killed off this policy? And we'll then make sure we don't do those things. All of those things, I think, are really good evidence of learning organizations where the teachers are being encouraged to be professional, and that skepticism is occupied as a position to avoid bad ideas. Mm-hmm. And that unless you're thinking in those kinds of ways, you're going to make mistakes, and the people who pay for the mistakes are going to be the most disadvantaged children.
Great. Thank you so much, David. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've really appreciated kind of digging into some of these. So yeah, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah, I think what I've really taken from this is the importance of not just taking things at face value, and as you say, like having more skepticism, but that's around all the assumptions that we might make in terms of what type of instruction we're doing, how we're assessing for that learning, how we know if what we're doing is effective,
who's benefiting and who's not.
Yeah. And I think that's what's really kind of sticking with me from our conversation here is really come back to how are we benefiting the students through what we're doing, and what sort of evidence do I have that's telling me if that's working or not? And I think that's where we can really, as educators, whether we're in the IBDP or not, really start to thread that line of, am I doing this because I think it's right, or am I doing this because I know it's right based off the evidence I'm gathering as well?
Yeah, and you're never going to know, certainty's our enemy. The being uncertain is healthy. It's uncomfortable, but it's healthy. The minute we're certain, we're about to make a mistake, I think, as a general principle.
David, thanks so much for taking the time, and I really appreciate you having this conversation with us. This felt like a really, really enjoyable conversation. So really appreciate you. Thanks for taking the time, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.
IB Unplugged is a Cognity podcast hosted by John Patton and Courtney Marlene and produced by Catalina Gaffney. Be sure to subscribe or follow and share with your fellow IB educators. If you'd like to submit a topic, request, or question, please do so on cognity.com/IB Unplugged. Let's keep the conversation going and support each other in teaching with confidence, creativity, and joy. See you next time.